Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight we're jumping into some unsettling true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
I was on a solo road trip through the Midwest, driving through miles of farmland with hardly any other cars in sight. It was getting late, and I realized I was running low on gas. The next town was still about 30 miles away, so I pulled off at this tiny, old-fashioned convenience store that seemed to be the only stop for miles. Inside, the place was empty except for the cashier, an older guy who seemed a little too friendly. He asked me where I was headed and made small talk while I filled up on gas and bought a snack. But the whole time, I felt like he was watching me too closely, like he was waiting for something. As I was leaving, he said, "Be careful out there. The roads aren't always safe after dark." I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. About 10 miles down the road, I noticed headlights behind me, getting closer and closer. At first, I thought it was just another car, but it followed me for miles, tailgating me and flashing its high beams. I pulled over to let it pass, but instead of going around, the car stopped right behind me. I panicked and floored it, speeding down the highway. The car followed for a few more miles before suddenly turning off onto a side road. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if the guy at the convenience store had something to do with it, but I didn't stop anywhere else until I reached a big city.
A couple of years ago, my buddies and I went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California. Somewhere in the middle of Texas, we stopped at a rest area to stretch our legs and get some snacks from the vending machine. We'd been there maybe 5 minutes when this beat-up old van pulled into the lot. At first, we didn't think anything of it, but the van parked right behind our car, blocking us in. There were 2 guys inside, both staring at us. One of them got out and started messing with something under the hood while the other guy stayed in the driver's seat watching us. We started to get a bad feeling and decided to leave, but since the van was blocking our exit, we had to wait. The guy who was under the hood kept looking over at us, smiling like he knew we were stuck. After what felt like forever, he got back in the van, and they just sat there, not moving. We didn't want to confront them, so we pretended to act normal, but after about 10 minutes, they finally moved their van. As soon as we had space, we peeled out of there. The weirdest part? They followed us for almost 30 miles before finally taking an exit. To this day, we have no idea what they wanted, or if it was just some bizarre coincidence, but it freaked us out enough that we avoided rest areas for the rest of the trip.
Last fall, my boyfriend and I were driving through Vermont, planning to camp out in the mountains. We found a nice spot just off a dirt road, far away from any main highways. It was peaceful at first, just us, the trees, and the sound of nature. But as night fell, things got strange. We were sitting by the fire when we started hearing what sounded like footsteps coming from the woods. At first, we figured it was an animal, but the steps sounded too heavy for that. My boyfriend grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but we didn't see anything. The footsteps stopped, but then, a few minutes later, we heard them again. This time, much closer. We called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, we packed up and left. As we were driving away, we noticed someone standing just inside the tree line, watching us leave. They were too far away to make out any details, but the sight was enough to make us floor it and get the hell out of there. A few years back, my girlfriend and I were driving through Nevada on a long stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was one of those roads where you don't see another car for hours, and the landscape is just endless desert. We were about an hour from our next stop when we saw a man walking along the side of the road. He wasn't hitchhiking, just walking, dressed in old dusty clothes. My girlfriend suggested we stop and ask if he needed help, but I had a bad feeling and kept driving. For the next 20 miles, we kept seeing him. Somehow, no matter how far we drove, we would spot him walking along the road. It didn't make any sense. We hadn't passed any other cars, and there was no way he could have kept up with us. Finally, we reached a small town, and when we mentioned the guy to the gas station attendant, he just shrugged and said, "Oh, that's probably the walker. Some say he's been out there for years." We never figured out how it was possible, but we were glad to be done with that road. Last summer, my friend and I were on a road trip through the Midwest. After a long day of driving, we decided to stop at a cheap roadside motel just off the highway in Nebraska. The place was sketchy, but we were too tired to keep going, so we checked in. The first weird thing was that the room key didn't work. Trying a few times, we finally got the door open, but once inside, the door wouldn't lock from the inside. We shrugged it off, figuring we were just paranoid from a long day on the road. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone jiggling the doorknob. I thought I was imagining it until it happened again. Someone was trying to get into our room. I jumped out of bed and went to check, but by the time I got to the door, the noise had stopped. We decided to leave, but when we tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. We were locked in. Panicking, we called the front desk, but no one answered. We banged on the door, trying to force it open, but it felt like something was blocking it from the outside. After what felt like hours, we finally heard a click, and the door swung open. There was no one outside. We grabbed our stuff and left as fast as we could. We never figured out what happened, but that was the last time we stayed at a cheap motel.
A few years ago, some friends and I took a road trip through West Virginia. We were exploring some of the back roads when we stumbled across an old, abandoned railroad tunnel. Being adventurous, we decided to walk through it, figuring it would be cool to explore. At first, it was just dark and quiet. The only sounds were our footsteps echoing off the tunnel walls. But about halfway through, we started hearing faint tapping sounds like someone knocking on metal. We thought it might be water dripping or maybe the wind, so we kept going. Then, the tapping got louder, and it seemed to be following us. We shone our flashlights around but couldn't see anything. That's when one of my friends pointed out that it was getting colder, unnaturally cold for a summer night. We decided to turn back, but as we did, we saw a faint light at the far end of the tunnel. At first, we thought it was another group of people coming in, but the light wasn't moving. It just hovered there, flickering. We ran the rest of the way out, and when we looked back, the light was gone. None of us wanted to admit how freaked out we were, but we didn't stick around to find out what it was. That tunnel is now off our list of places to visit.
A few years back, I was driving home after visiting some family out in the country. I was using GPS to navigate, but it rerouted me through some back roads I wasn't familiar with. The sun was setting, and I figured I'd be home in a couple of hours, so I didn't worry too much. But as the road got narrower and rougher, I started to realize I was lost. My phone lost signal, and there were no signs of civilization, just trees and fields. I kept driving, hoping to find a main road, but after about 30 minutes, I came across a fork in the road that wasn't on my GPS. I decided to take the left path, thinking it would lead me back to the highway. Instead, it led me deeper into the woods. Eventually, the road just stopped. It wasn't a dead end, but it turned into this overgrown path that looked like no one had driven on it in years. That's when I noticed something weird. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no bugs, nothing. Just dead silence. My car's headlights were the only light, and it was starting to get dark. I turned the car around as fast as I could and headed back the way I came. When I finally made it to a gas station hours later, the attendant told me that road used to be a logging route, but had been abandoned for decades. No one drives down there anymore, and now I know why.
A couple of years ago, my friend and I were on a cross-country road trip. We stopped at this rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere, just off some highway in Wyoming. It was late at night, and we were the only ones there, except for the gas station attendant. As I went inside to pay for gas, I noticed a guy sitting in a beat-up car near the back of the parking lot. He He was just sitting there, not moving, but I could feel him watching me. My friend was in the passenger seat of our car, so I didn't think too much of it. When I came back out, the guy had moved his car closer to ours. He was just staring at us, his face partially hidden under a hoodie. My friend and I exchanged a glance and we both got a bad vibe. As soon as we pulled out of the gas station, the guy started following us. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but he stayed on our tail for miles. I tried to shake him by speeding up and taking random turns, but he stayed right behind us. At one point, I turned down a narrow dirt road, hoping he'd leave, but he followed. Eventually, I spotted a small town up ahead and turned onto the main road. The guy finally veered off in another direction. To this day, I don't know if he was just messing with us or had something more sinister planned, but we didn't stop again until we reached a larger, more populated area.
My boyfriend and I were driving through the middle of Arizona late at night. We were trying to make it to a motel before midnight, but the desert roads were almost empty, except for the occasional passing car. At one point, we noticed a set of headlights in the distance behind us, getting closer and closer. They eventually caught up to us, and the driver started flashing their high beams at us. We thought maybe something was wrong with our car, so I slowed down, expecting them to pull alongside us. Instead, they stayed behind us, flashing their lights every few seconds. This went on for miles, and it was getting unnerving. We decided to stop at a rest area to check our car, but when I pulled off, the other car followed. That's when I knew something wasn't right. We sped off, trying to lose them, but they stayed on us for the next 10 miles. Finally, we saw a sign for a state police station up ahead. The moment we took the exit, the car behind us suddenly swerved onto another road and disappeared into the desert. We pulled into the police station, and when I told the officer what happened, he just shook his head. Apparently, this happens sometimes. People trying to scare tourists on the open road. But it sure didn't feel like a prank at the time. I was on a road trip from New Mexico to Utah, driving through long stretches of desert, when I saw a guy standing by the road with his thumb out. Normally, I wouldn't stop for hitchhikers, but this guy looked desperate, standing there in the blistering sun. So I pulled over. He got in, and right away, I could tell something was off. He didn't say much, just mumbled about how his car had broken down a few miles back. I tried to make small talk, but he kept giving me one-word answers, staring straight ahead. After about 10 minutes, he suddenly asked, "What would you do if you found out I wasn't who I said I was?" That threw me off, but I tried to laugh it off and said, "What do you mean?" He just smiled and didn't say anything else. My gut told me to get him out of my car. I lied and said I had to take a different exit to meet up with a friend. I pulled over at the next gas station and told him this was as far as I could take him. He stared at me for a few seconds, then quietly got out and walked off without saying another word. I don't know what his deal was, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out.
My girlfriend and I were on a road trip through Kansas, heading back home after a long weekend. It was late, around midnight, and we decided to stop at a rest area for a quick bathroom break. The place was completely empty, just our car and the vending machines glowing under the fluorescent lights. As we got out of the car, I noticed a man sitting on a bench near the entrance. He didn't look homeless or anything, but he was just sitting there, staring at us as we walked by. My girlfriend went into the bathroom first while I waited by the car. A few minutes later, the man walked over to me and said, "You should leave. It's not safe here." I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated the same thing. "It's not safe here. You should leave." My girlfriend came back out and I told her we should go. As we got in the car, the man started walking toward us again, repeating, "It's not safe here." We sped out of there without looking back. I have no idea what he was talking about, but it freaked us out enough that we didn't stop again until we reached the next town.
A couple of years ago, I was driving through Colorado with some friends on a summer road trip. We stopped at this remote campground to spend the night, and there were only a few other people there. One of the spots was taken up by this old RV that looked like it hadn't moved in years. We set up camp, and everything seemed fine at first. But as night fell, we started hearing strange noises coming from the RV. It sounded like someone was walking around inside. But when we got close, the windows were dark and no one seemed to be inside. One of my friends knocked on the door to see if anyone was there, but no one answered. We thought maybe it was abandoned, but we still heard noises throughout the night. Footsteps, the sound of something being dragged, even whispers. The next morning, we decided to leave early. As we packed up, an old man who worked at the campground walked over and told us that no one had rented that RV spot in months. We didn't ask any more questions and got out of there. I was driving through rural Idaho on a solo road trip, making good time, but I had to stop for gas and a bathroom break. I pulled into this small, old-fashioned gas station in the middle of nowhere, the kind that has just one employee and an old, dingy bathroom around the back. After filling up, I went inside to use the restroom. As soon as I walked in, I noticed someone standing in the corner by the sinks, staring into the mirror. The guy didn't acknowledge me or move, just kept staring straight ahead. I quickly used the bathroom and tried to get out of there as fast as I could. As I was washing my hands, the guy suddenly said, "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know how to respond, so I just kept drying my hands, trying to act calm. Then he said it again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of the bathroom. As I got into my car and started driving away, I glanced back to see him standing at the edge of the parking lot, just watching me leave. I have no idea what his problem was, but I didn't stop anywhere else until I was in the next big town. Last summer, my girlfriend and I planned a road trip down the Oregon coast. We wanted to stay at a small local Airbnb instead of a chain hotel for the experience. We found a house listed just outside a small town. Looked decent, pictures were normal, and the reviews were okay. So we booked it for 2 nights. When we got there, things were off. The house looked much older than the photos, and there was an odd smell inside, kind of like mildew and something else we couldn't place. The host wasn't there when we arrived, which we thought was weird since they were supposed to greet us. We settled in, but when night came, things got worse. We kept hearing noises from the attic, like someone was walking around. But when I went up to check, there was nothing there. Later, while lying in bed, I noticed the handle of the bedroom door slowly turning. My heart stopped, but the door didn't open. The next morning, we woke up to find the front door wide open. We never figured out if someone had broken in or if it was a bad Airbnb situation, but we didn't stick around for the second night.
My friend and I were on a cross-country road trip last year, trying to avoid major highways to get a more scenic experience. We were driving through the Appalachian Mountains, using GPS to navigate these random back roads when the signal cut out, leaving us with no directions. No big deal, right? We just kept driving straight, figuring we'd eventually find our way back to civilization. Except the road didn't lead anywhere. It turned into this narrow dirt path surrounded by thick trees. We figured we'd made a wrong turn and tried to turn around, but as we did, a beat-up truck appeared behind us, blocking the road. At first, the driver just sat there staring at us through his windshield. I waved to let him know we needed to pass, but he didn't move. Instead, he started revving his engine, like he was daring us to make a move. My friend and I were panicking at this point. There was nowhere to go, and the guy wasn't budging. Eventually, we just reversed down the road, all the way back to the last junction we could remember. When we looked back, the truck was still sitting there, like he had been waiting for us. We sped off and found a new route.
3 years ago, my friends and I planned a road trip from Montana to Washington. There were 4 of us, and we had decided to camp out along the way. On the second night, we found a secluded campsite deep in the forest. It was beautiful but very isolated, no other campers around for miles. That night, we all went to bed early, exhausted from the day's drive. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to find one of my friends, Dan, gone. His sleeping bag and belongings were still there, but he was missing. We thought maybe he'd gone to the bathroom, but when he didn't return after 30 minutes, we started to panic. We searched the campsite and surrounding forest, calling his name, but there was no trace of him. The weirdest part? His shoes were still by his tent. He never went anywhere without shoes. We ended up calling the park rangers and a search team was brought in, but Dan was never found. To this day, we have no idea what happened to him. It's like he vanished into thin air. I was on a solo road trip from Chicago to New Mexico a couple of years ago. Late at night, I stopped at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere for some gas and food. The place was sketchy, but I was too tired to keep going. Inside, the cashier kept staring at me, making me feel uncomfortable, so I hurried through buying snacks. As I left the store, I noticed an old man sitting on the curb by the entrance. He had a weird grin on his face and just stared at me as I walked past him to my car. I ignored him and started pumping gas. A few minutes later, I saw the same old man standing on the other side of my car, just staring. I asked if he needed something, and he just smiled wider, like he was enjoying making me uncomfortable. When I finished, I got into my car quickly. Before I could even start it, the old man knocked on my window. He leaned in close and said, "You shouldn't be out here alone, you know. Bad things happen on the road." Then he walked off into the darkness without another word. I don't know if he was messing with me or genuinely dangerous, but I left that place as fast as I could. I was on a solo road trip from Chicago to New Mexico a couple of years ago. Late at night, I stopped at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere for some gas and food. The place was sketchy, but I was too tired to keep going. Inside, the cashier kept staring at me, making me feel uncomfortable, so I hurried through buying snacks. As I left the store, I noticed an old man sitting on the curb by the entrance. He had a weird grin on his face and just stared at me as I walked past him to my car. I ignored him and started pumping gas. A few minutes later, I saw the same old man standing on the other side of my car, just staring. I asked if he needed something, and he just smiled wider, like he was enjoying making me uncomfortable. When I finished, I got into my car quickly. Before I could even start it, the old man knocked on my window. He leaned in close and said, "You shouldn't be out here alone, you know. Bad things happen on the road." Then he walked off into the darkness without another word. I don't know if he was messing with me or genuinely dangerous, but I left that place as fast as I could. I was on a solo road trip from Chicago to New Mexico a couple of years ago. Late at night, I stopped at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere for some gas and food. The place was sketchy, but I was too tired to keep going. Inside, the cashier kept staring at me, making me feel uncomfortable, so I hurried through buying snacks. As I left the store, I noticed an old man sitting on the curb by the entrance. He had a weird grin on his face and just stared at me as I walked past him to my car. I ignored him and started pumping gas. A few minutes later, I saw the same old man standing on the other side of my car, just staring. I asked if he needed something, and he just smiled wider, like he was enjoying making me uncomfortable. When I finished, I got into my car quickly. Before I could even start it, the old man knocked on my window. He leaned in close and said, "You shouldn't be out here alone, you know. Bad things happen on the road." Then he walked off into the darkness without another word. I don't know if he was messing with me or genuinely dangerous, but I left that place as fast as I could. Title, The Man in the Woods. Posted by You Never Camp Again. Last summer, my girlfriend and I went on a road trip through Utah, hitting up all the national parks. We decided to camp out one night at a free campsite in a really remote area. It was stunning, completely isolated, with a beautiful view of the mountains. We set up our tent, made a fire, and were just relaxing when I noticed movement in the distance. At first, I thought it was a deer or something, but then I realized it was a man. He was walking along the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't see him clearly. I didn't think much of it at first, figured it was another camper. But as the sun went down, the man kept appearing at random spots around our campsite. He never got close, just stayed at a distance, watching us. It was so unsettling that we decided to pack up and leave. As we were driving away, we saw him again, this time standing in the middle of the dirt road watching us leave. We didn't stop, and we never went back to that campsite. 2 years ago, my college roommate and I went on a road trip through Nevada. We were driving through one of those long, desolate stretches where you don't see anyone for miles. It was late afternoon when we passed a man hitchhiking on the side of the road. He looked disheveled, but harmless enough. My friend suggested we stop, but something about him gave me a bad feeling, so I kept driving. About 15 minutes later, we saw another hitchhiker, a woman this time, standing by the road holding a sign that said, "Help me." My friend started freaking out, insisting we stop, But again, I had this gut feeling that something was off, so we didn't. A few minutes later, we saw the same woman walking along the road up ahead, despite us having driven for miles. There was no way she could have gotten there that fast. That's when we realized something really weird was going on, and we sped up to get out of there. When we got to the next gas station and told the attendant what we'd seen, he just shook his head and said, "You did the right thing. People go missing out there all the time." My friend and I were driving through the Midwest, taking a road trip from Chicago to Denver. Around dusk, we hit a massive traffic jam due to road construction. Google Maps suggested a detour off the highway that would supposedly save us 30 minutes, so we took it. At first, the back road seemed normal. Cornfields, barns, and the occasional farmhouse. But soon the pavement gave way to gravel, and then dirt. The road narrowed, and the trees started to get denser on either side. We hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. Suddenly, we came across a sign. Road closed. But the weird part? There were no cones, no barriers, just the sign. Feeling uneasy, we turned around. That's when we saw them. 3 men, standing about 20 feet from our car, half hidden by the trees, just staring. No expressions, no movement. We floored it out of there, heart pounding. To this day, I don't know who they were or what they wanted. A couple of years ago, I was on a solo road trip through the Southwest. I needed gas, so I pulled off at a remote station in the middle of nowhere. One of those places where it feels like the last person to fill up was 10 years ago. The gas pumps were old, but they worked, so I filled up and went inside to pay. The cashier, an older guy with a gruff demeanor, kept staring at me while I paid, just staring. It made me uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off as some small-town weirdness. As I was about to leave, he said, "You might want to check your back tire. Looks like it's low." I glanced back at my car but couldn't see anything wrong. Still, I pulled over to the side to check. As I was bent down looking at the tire, I heard the store door slam behind me. I looked up to see the attendant standing in the doorway holding a wrench. My heart nearly stopped. I jumped back into my car and floored it out of there, not even looking back. It wasn't until later that night, when I stopped at a motel, that I realized all my tires were. A few summers ago, my friends and I were on a camping trip, driving through a remote mountain pass. It was already dark, and we hadn't seen another car for miles. Suddenly, our headlights caught a couple standing on the side of the road, waving us down. The guy was holding a gas can, and the woman looked frantic. They claimed their car had broken down and asked if we could give them a lift to the nearest gas station. Something about it didn't feel right, and we hesitated. The guy kept insisting, getting angrier the longer we didn't answer. That's when my friend, who was driving, just hit the gas and sped off. A few miles down the road, we came across a gas station and pulled in to report the stranded couple to the attendant. But when we told him about it, his face went pale. He said, "You're lucky you didn't stop. There's been reports of a couple doing this exact thing, then robbing or worse to people who stopped to help." During a road trip through Arizona, we decided to take a scenic route that was said to offer stunning desert views. But we miscalculated how long the detour would take, and before we knew it, we were driving through the desert at night, the only light coming from our headlights. About an hour in, we saw a car pulled over on the side of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing, and there was a man standing next to it, waving us down. My first thought was to stop and help, but something in my gut told me to keep driving. As we passed, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw another figure crouching behind the car, as if they were waiting for us to stop. We sped off, heart racing, and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were mildas away and back on the main highway.